Well, welcome. I'm Bob Henderson, the Nomad Dad, and we're in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And with me today, I'm very pleased to have Danielle DiMartino Booth.
Well, I'm pleased to be here. What a fabulous event so far.
It is a fabulous event that we've all attended. Is this your first time in KL?
This is my first time in Asia, period.
Wow.
Yes, I'm delighted.
It's a really fun place, don't you think?
It is. I actually started my journey in Singapore, and you know what? I like organization.
Well, then you'll love Singapore.
Yes, indeed.
So, your thoughts on Singapore versus KL? I know it may be a small sample size, but I see them quite different. What do you think?
Being that I've been in so many U.S. industrial cities, big industrial cities, Kuala Lumpur has that. You feel that you're in a city that is a financial center of the world, but at the same time, very much a productive center of the world as well. You feel that industrial edge about it.
Yeah, definitely a financial center. Mm-hmm. No question about it. Well, Danielle runs her own economic forecasting firm. I guess it's Quill Intelligence.
I do, yes. QI Research was founded, I published 7 days after I left the Fed. I love writing. I love producing research, and we publish 8 times a week. There's nothing in the world that keeps you more in touch with the economy, monetary policy making, and your readers than writing all the time.
So you referred to working for the Federal Reserve in
Yes.
Dallas, and that was part of your experience. And apparently you didn't like it because you wrote a book about it called Fed Up. So briefly, before we get into today, what is it that concerned you with the Fed?
Well, in a nutshell, inflation and mismeasurement of inflation. And if there was one big takeaway, I started at the Fed in 2006, and I'm screaming from the rooftops, we have a problem with asset inflation, that this housing situation's not going to end well, and yet we're not capturing it in the inflation metrics that we use to make monetary policy. There's something clearly wrong here. And there was a lot of soul searching in the years that followed the Lehman bankruptcy, and internal staff papers and debates and gnashing of the teeth. We need a new mousetrap. We need a way to not repeat these sins of the past the next time we potentially have a crisis at our doorstep. And we should do that by creating a more modern, sophisticated, and comprehensive measure of inflation. And after all of literally 2 years of this, they said, well, if we do that, and they actually came up with a better mousetrap, but if we do that, we really won't be able to run unconventional monetary policy because the inflation will stop us in our tracks. So we're just going to hide behind lies. And that was the policy. So it got me irritated enough to write a book.
I remember in late 2007, I was a retail investment business. Mm-hmm. Ben Bernanke said the crisis was contained. Now, I was always taught you don't fight the Fed, and I assume he had more data available to him than I did, and that proved to be a real problem for me in giving advice. From that point forward, I've lost total faith in anything I hear from them. That may be slightly unfair, but when you talk about being fed up, and I look at today, I left my business 8 years ago because I thought this just cannot continue. This doesn't end well. Well, I've been dead wrong so far. Mm-hmm. And we were never taught about these monetary tools that they have used. And again, going back to Bernanke, didn't he say, well, we're only going to use these for a while and then we'll pull everything back? And I don't believe that's ever happened.
It was going to be a very quick exit. And that was always the game plan. And you mentioned, having to hear Bernanke say that the subprime bubble would be contained. There would be no effect on the broader economy. Janet Yellen at the time was saying the same thing, by the way. She was the president of the San Francisco Fed while the subprime crisis literally blew up in her backyard. I mean, we all remember the at-length interviews with the CEO then of Countrywide, Angela Mazzillo. And there really was a shared narrative. Of course, they were wrong. They were dead wrong, but try having been on the inside at the time and saying, you're dead wrong. The work that I did on subprime, even in the aftermath of the crisis blowing up in policymakers' face was so unwelcome inside the institution. My original paper on the subprime crisis is now required reading in most college economics programs. Even after everything had happened, they were still in denial. But to your point, though, the confidence bubble in central bankers is still intact. It really is. I think that we're about to finally see a turning point in that confidence for the very first time.
We'll go back 2 years and so-called transitory inflation. There's another absolute
Yes.
mistake.
It was a mistake. Part of it had to do with a leadership vacuum, with the Biden administration holding Jay Powell hostage, dividing the staff. There was a lot of Game of Thrones going about because Biden was strongly of the mind to appoint a progressive and somebody who would advocate immediately for a central bank digital currency and central banking addressing climate change. There's no tool in the toolbox for these things. And yet, in the end, there was so much pushback that he ended up being forced to stay with Jay Powell the minute the Senate confirmed him, really after being, again, held hostage, left in a holding tank. First thing he did the day the Senate confirmed him was get rid of transitory and say, this is the 2% inflation target, and by the way, we're going there come hell or high water.
Is it that they don't have real world experience?
In large part.
Yeah.
It really is that simple. And that's why, from somebody who used to be on the inside of the Fed, to hear Jerome Hayden Powell, Esquire, an attorney who, as Undersecretary of the Treasury, worked directly with Warren Buffett to resolve the Treasury scandal at Salomon Brothers, to hear a pragmatist at the podium mention things like, gee, it sounds like jobs hard to get from the confidence, from the confidence board is really going. Indeed, job postings seem to be declining at a precipitous rate. It looks like our own statisticians can't seem to hit a payroll report if they tried. We know that they're artificially inflated. To hear somebody say these is so unorthodox. You just know that the PhDs in economics at the Fed it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. To have somebody recognize practical inflation measures, he is making enemies day in and day out internally at the staff.
Well, before we go to today, as I look at the cover of your book, it says Fed Up and Why the Fed is Bad
For America.
So why is it bad for America?
Well, if, as the front page of the Federal Reserve's website says, that monetary policy is required to be made in the interests of the public good, if that's the case, then they're failing. And time and again, they've gone back to the well of zero interest rate policy, of blowing up the balance sheet, quantitative easing, things that have approaches that have been proven to elongate business cycles and thereby amplify the boom-bust cycle, that von Mises warned against many moons ago. I'm certainly in his camp, not Keynes. But ignoring failure. The world's greatest leaders, Sandy Weill, when he was looking back on his career as a banker, said the biggest mistake I ever made was letting Jamie Dimon walk out the door. That was hubris. And look what he went to do. If you cannot recognize your failures and learn from them and go forward on a better path, then you are, by design, agreeing to fail again and again. And that's what the Federal Reserve has done, really, since August the 12th, 1987, when Alan Greenspan took office. They've agreed to go down a proven path of failure time and again.
So 2 months after that, we had a 22% drop in the stock market
We did.
one Monday morning. And I believe he pledged to provide whatever liquidity is needed.
The Federal
and I
Reserve
think
stands
from that
prepared
point forward,
to back the financial and the banking and financial systems. This was a one-line assurance released on October the 20th, 1987. People get so confused. They say, well, 1998, the failure of long-term capital management, that was the birth of the Fed put. No. You recognize that it goes to 87.
and from that point forward, it's been a totally different animal. from a layman's standpoint. Of course. Okay, so a question. If we abolish the Federal Reserve in the U.S., seeing as how most of the other countries have a central bank, would we still be able to operate?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is no, which you get to in the very last chapter of Fed Up, which is my solution. And really what it does is it revisits the foundations of the Fed. There was a financial crisis at the time, riddled with gout. JP Morgan brought everybody into his parlor in New York and said, I'm not going to be here forever. We're no longer an emerging nation. We're a developed country. Like the Bank of England, it might be appropriate for us to have a central bank just in case, upon my death, I can't save the financial system over and over again in my parlor. And that was the genesis of the Federal Reserve. Fast forward 100 years, and we've seen how very vulnerable intellectual property can be to theft. And that's something that indeed has become a sovereign situation in the United States. Look at what technology has done to intellectual property and the robbing of intellectual property, and then suggest to me that we should let all the guardians of the biggest financial system in the world take the rest of their careers off and just leave the financial system unguarded completely. That doesn't work either. But tearing the Federal Reserve down to its foundations and rebuilding it with individuals who are not in ivory towers, ones who used to be in finance, and that was the beginnings of their career. Pension fund managers who've had to deal with a zero interest rate environment that's pressed them to invest inappropriately to safeguard the assets of retirees. People who've run corporations, individuals who are on the receiving end of monetary policy, not people who've never had a payroll and had a headcount. Those are the kinds of individuals who need to be running a central bank, pragmatists who understand not just how to make monetary policy using some pie-in-the-sky model, but rather how it plays out in the real world.
It's become politicized.
It's become politicized, and it's become highly malleable to political manipulation. And that is why you have individuals espousing modern monetary theory and the idea that you can grow the Fed's balance sheet to infinity and beyond and never have repercussions. As somebody who's studied British history about how that ends.
Okay, so you bring up MMT. And I sit here thinking, for the last few years, it seems like a lot of times the news isn't so good. For example, this year, we'll get a report on employment. And then next month, it'll be drastically revised lower. And that's happened, 8 out of 9 months or something like that this year? And a lot of these indicators come out, everything's wonderful, Wall Street applauds it, and next month it's revised lower and nobody looks at it. You mentioned the blowing up of the balance sheet. We got a lot of zombie companies.
A lot.
Yet everything seems to be in pretty good shape, at least from an official standpoint. I talk to people that think the economy's just wonderful sometimes.
And many do.
It depends who you are.
It really depends on the eye of the beholder, but we have indeed seen certain thresholds breached. We have seen a rise in Americans on Main Street. Their perceptions of the job market have definitively turned to the negative. Now, they're being gaslit to kingdom come, and they're being told that everything is hunky-dory. And if you ask a lot of individuals who were in the stock market, I mean, in 1995, when the Fed successfully engineered the only soft landing, it was because the unemployment rate was dropping. And there was a 24% run-up in stocks to the Fed's first rate cut. We saw a 29% run-up in the stock market, in the S&P 500, up until that first rate cut in September 2024. That means that the faith is that the Fed's going to engineer a bigger soft landing. And yet I've just told you, and you recognize that from the first time private payrolls were announced at 2.4 million in the year ended March 31st, 2024, that 2.4 million is now 1.4 million. You don't hear about that. They're not screaming about that on the White House lawn, are they? They're not singing that. And yet the revisions are there, and now the public's aware.
You think they are?
Oh, well, that's what the surveys tell us.
I mean, I guess if you lost your job, you know.
And that's exactly the threshold that we've breached. There is a gauge called jobs hard to get. It's kind of self-explanatory. Jobs are hard to get. Once that crosses a certain milestone, if you will, that means the cat's out of the bag. So your average working American is more than aware that job losses are what they are. We've lost 1 million full-time jobs in the last year. In the same time, we've created 1.3 million part-time jobs. The gig working economy, there are more part-time working Americans today than there were at the height of the financial crisis.
And maybe they have 2 or 3 jobs.
That's the point.
And that gets counted 3 times?
It does.
Yeah. So it's really not.
No,
Legit.
you're not. If you've just lost your full-time job and you're driving Uber to make ends meet, it is time to consider moving in with mom and dad to give
Or
you
moving to Malaysia.
or
It's a
moving to
lot less
Malaysia, or
expensive.
I have friends who've moved to Italy, and the only thing they tell me about, we used to have discussions about economics and the markets. Now all they tell me about is what the dinner tab was because it's so low.
Yeah.
My gosh, I fed the whole family. I didn't even spend 100 euros and I walked away stinking drunk. Why wasn't I in Italy a long time ago? It's really incredible to see. Again, one more case in time. August of 2024, 369,000 retirees rejoined the workforce in the United States. Why is that?
Why? They need the money. Inflation.
Maybe their kids need the money. Deflation. Much different dynamic. If you're going back to work to help your kids make ends meet.
Okay, so we're in an election year. Mm-hmm. We'll run roughly $2 trillion deficit.
Absolutely. It's the American way.
Fiscal year 2024, that's the highest ever in peacetime. 7% plus of the GDP. Mm-hmm. That, in my view, is why you still have reasonable growth in the economy. Can the $2 trillion deficits go on forever, or is this just a ploy to get them through the election?
Yes to your second question, no to the first. And by the way, the problem with $2 trillion deficits is that you've got more than $1 trillion going just to service the debt. Right. The reason that disinflationary and deflationary forces have become so overwhelming is that the last time you had legislation passed in the form of helicopter money, you're giving people the money directly. You're bypassing the banking system. You are taking away the ability of the Fed to ease financial conditions. You're just giving the money to the people. That creates inflation. If, however, you go back to the bridge to nowhere, pork barrel spending, the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure spending that we've seen, well, but now you're bringing back the requirement to have unionized workforces. And you've got to bribe people. That's what we do in America with pork barrel spending. You've got to have DEI, ESG. That's when your deficit spending gets mired in the mud and accomplishes very little in terms of economic output and starts to become a true drag on economic growth. That's where we are because it's not helicopter
Is
money.
that why we had a 50 basis point cut? Is it things really worse than they're portraying? Is that what that means?
So a little inside baseball here. The 1983, 1990, and 2001 recessions in the United States of America never saw a decline in consumption. That's usually not where...
I wouldn't think that.
You would think that it's a 70% GDP.
If that's
that is
70% of
consumption,
GDP, yeah.
then you would think that you could never have a recession if consumption didn't decline. And yet, in 3 modern time recessions, consumption never fell. Wow. It is business investment that leads the U.S. economy into and out of recession, period, end. That is why, and this is one of the few good takeaways I had, when I saw Chair Powell reference the Beige Book. You're like, who cares about the Beige Book? The Fed does, because that is all 12 districts nationwide gathering reconnaissance on the ground from companies that sell things, companies that service things, companies that make things. And when you have all 12 districts report in 1 month, we're seeing declining consumption, you have the Fed staff with their hair on fire.
So that's the 50 basis points.
That was the 50 basis points.
They've curtailed the quantitative tightening this year.
So
It would appear that the money supply might be growing. Is this inflationary next year, the year beyond? So that 2% that they think they're hitting and declaring victory, is that just a Pyrrhic victory and we're back to the races again in the near future? Or are we going to have a disinflationary situation?
the Fed is really hoping for the back to the races. They've got all the tools in the toolbox for that.
That's what they want to do.
That's what they're not going to get it, but that's what they want.
So you don't think it's going to be inflationary going forward?
Not in the near term. Now, if there was to be a blue wave as the outcome to the election, I'd be shorting every treasury bond in the world.
Yeah, and buying gold.
And absolutely. A blue wave would give you a green light to bring MMT back big. If you had a Congress that was fully on board with a progressive, and by the way, it was Donald Trump who spent more than any president in U.S. history in peacetime.
And called for ZERP too, I believe.
He screened for ZERP. He tapped into an organization that usually is deployed for hurricane relief to extend emergency unemployment benefits. He tapped the Centers for Disease Control to extend the rental eviction moratorium. He poured as much gasoline onto the fuel of inflation as any president in U.S. history. We forget this. Of course, he was a New York Democrat in his past life, and he publicly contributed to Kamala Harris's, both of her campaigns and both of Hillary Clinton's campaigns.
And went to her daughter's wedding, but
absolutely. But no, your history is the lesson. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. If you have gridlock in Congress and some party in the Senate, and there's about a 76% probability that the Republican Party is going to retake the U.S. Senate, then we'll have gridlock. And you won't have modern monetary theory take back over.
Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. Let's summarize. Over the next 12 to 18 months, you're not so sure there's going to be a lot of inflation, even with the fact that we're not reducing the balance sheet, the Fed balance sheet, to the extent that we were, so the money supply is in better shape than it might have been. You're looking for some sort of deflation or disinflation? Is that what you're calling for? And if that's the case, then I think bonds would still be good investment.
Bonds would, but gold would equally as well. And remember, the Federal Reserve just published a report blueprinting the reduction of the mortgage-backed securities holdings through 2035. So it's tacitly informed you, we're getting out of that business. Yes, we're tapering our Treasury holdings. This has nothing to do.
What's that do to housing?
It's not going to help it.
MBS, yes, okay.
It's not going to help it. But the Fed laid out a blueprint just a few weeks ago through 2035. So they're out of that business. And they'll actually play catch up with the quantitative tightening that they could not do because mortgages were not prepaying in a higher interest rate environment. Regardless, I'm not calling for disinflation. Corporate America is. Revenues are growing. If they're growing, depends on the company. We're seeing a massive bankruptcy cycle that is accelerating.
Commercial real estate next year.
Getting worse. But because revenues are running so far underneath compensation costs, we are staring down the barrel of a third major wave of layoffs. And there's only one thing really that trumps inflation, and that's if you have no paycheck at all. And that's why baby boomers are rejoining the workforce. It's to help their children's children make sure there's food on the table. And that is disinflationary by design.
Stagflation in the cards or not?
Stagflation in the cards to the extent that there might be a prolonged port strike in the United States. But again, it's all about pricing power. And as long as layoffs are going to continue to build, and therefore paychecks continue to disappear, or a full-time job replaced by driving for Uber, and having to move back in with mom and dad, you better get along with them, then we're going to continue to see disinflationary impulses. And that's exactly what the prolonged industrial recession, by the way, prolonged industrial recession globally is telling us.
Danielle DiMartino Booth, joy to have you here with us today. And I'm Bob Henderson. I'm the Nomad Dad.